Watzke, Mr. Weinberg, President of the Thuringian Embassy, Parliament, Prime Minister, Minister Taubert, representatives of the embassies and consulates, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly 77 years ago, on the 11th of April 1945, American soldiers reached the city of Nordhausen. In this town, 2 of the 40 camps of the Mittelbau Dora complex were located. The Subcamp Böke Kaserne, and here in Nordhausen at Camp Dora, Americans were only able to save several hundred of inmates, most of them very sick, that had been left behind by the SS. The other inmates of the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp had been driven onto death marches the week before by the SS. Today it is possible for us to come together here in this place for the first time since 2019 to commemorate those who suffered here, and in particular to commemorate the roughly 20,000 people who did not survive the concentration camp Mittelbau Dora. We're particularly grateful that today we have 2 former inmates of Mittelbau Dora concentration camp amongst us, Mr. Watzke and Mr. Weinberg. My heartfelt thanks go to you that you are here with us and that you are enriching these days in April with the possibility to come into conversation with you. But our thoughts also go to those who are not able to be with us today. The former inmate Stanislav Kaunov from Ukraine had already begun to prepare his travel. Mr. Kaunov lives in a suburb of Kiev. We are in close contact with him and he assures us he's okay. His optimism is unshakable. We also want to remember Boris Romanchenko. He and all the men from his Ukrainian village, he was taken to Dortmund in 1942 as forced labourer. After one failed attempt to escape, he came to the Buchenwald concentration camp. He survived Peenemünde and Mittelbau Dora. He was liberated finally in Bergen-Belsen. Ever since his first participation in a commemorative event in the year 2000, he often attended the anniversaries of the liberation in his role as Vice President of the International Committee Buchenwald Dora and Commandos. On 18th of March this year, he was killed by a Russian bombing raid in his flat in Kharkiv. We grieve for Boris Romanchenko. When we commemorate the 11th of April 1945 and the cruelties of the concentration camp, we don't just want to grieve. It is the task of concentration camp memorials to transfer historical knowledge and to show how these concentration camps could function, who was responsible. This year, we want to focus on the topic of flight. Today, in this location, and tomorrow in Elrich and on the Nordhäuser Memorial Cemetery. As hard it was to escape the camps, many inmates tried at least. This particularly applies for the period when the camps were cleared and for the death marches. When the American troops liberated this place on the 11th of April 1945, at the same time many inmates undertook the courageous attempt to escape their captors during the transports to a Germany that had not yet been liberated. On this very day, about 200 inmates of the Ilfeld camp fled into the forests near Ested during the death march. 110 of them were killed by German soldiers on the next day during a massacre in these very forests. Flight was only successful in those cases where inmates had help from the German population. flights from concentration camps shows in a very painful way how close the murderous reality of the camps was to the everyday lives of Germans. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to give the floor to the Prime Minister of Thuringia in just a moment. Following his speech, we'll hear from two representatives of the young generation and explain how they relate to the history of the concentration camp. Carla Becker and Hendrik Höhn have been volunteers in this memorial site since last September as federal volunteers and will give us insights into their perspective on the work of the memorial. Thank you. Mr. Watzke, Mr. Weinstein. We are grateful and happy that we can be here with you today. Therefore, also some heartfelt thanks from my perspective, because from the perspective of the people who experienced the concentration camp, we are able to have a much more authentic relationship to what occurred here. Therefore, it is good, it is right that we spend time together with the remaining survivors and that we come together in person here today and also yesterday in Buchenwald. Allow me some personal remarks. It was the 14th of April in 1995. When André Bubalo, a survivor of Dora, asked me to drive him up to Dora. My children at the time were 12 and 9 years old. We'd been spending time together in Buchenwald and in Dora, but on the 14th he said, "Can you drive me to Dora?" What was interesting for me was he had been a cheerful person in Buchenwald because he was a Dora inmate. Buchenwald was not his emotional experience. So we parked the car, he took my children by the hands and entered the camp. He started to cry. And I realized that my children changed. He took them to the crematorium to explain to them that he survived right here, next to the crematorium. And he then told them what he had to do there, which was indescribable for my children, because children could not imagine what happened here in Buchenwald, in Auschwitz, at the crematoria. For me, this is a memory, because we went to visit him later in Split, and what was interesting is that his children knew a lot less of their father's past than my children, because my children had had the opportunity to listen to him speak here in the authentic place when he opened his soul. I'm telling you this because it played an important role yesterday in Buchenwald. It matters from which perspective we are speaking when we speak about concentration camps. Is it the perspective of a state, which says, okay, for us, this is the past, we meet once a year to place a wreath, we make sad faces, and then we return to normal life? Yesterday, you, Mr. Wagner, found some clear words that we shouldn't focus on ritualized commemoration. We need to permanently work on what has happened here. And if you allow me some current remarks, yesterday in France, one candidate received 27%, another 24% of the votes. And if you then add the 7% of the third candidate, you realize how your spine starts to tingle if all of a sudden Samour says Pétain had saved the Jews in occupied France, which is an obvious lie. When I traveled to Paris, I visited the memorial site. I talked to Serge and Beate Klasfeld, and the head of the memorial site showed me the original document where Pétain crossed out everything related to Jews and assigned all the Jews to extermination. And Mr. Zamora tells an obvious lie as part of the the election campaign, and both received near enough, 24, 27%. That's clearly more than what Macron got. So we need to be careful. We should never be too sure that these things are in the past. And allow me another current remark. When I drove here, I read a text in the Via Novosti. That's the official news paper of Russia. It speaks of the confrontation in Ukraine, and the wording is that the main objective of the military intervention is to denazify Ukraine. And the author writes that the Bandera elites need to be exterminated because they cannot be re-educated. That's exactly the same wording that led to the creation of concentration camps. So turning this around now, with the indication that denazification has to occur, that of course is indescribable to anyone who has died as a result of National Socialism and was killed. And therefore it is so important that we also remember Boris Romanchenko. Because Boris Romanchenko survived all of that as a Soviet soldier. After 1945, he did military service in the GDR, because the Soviet army that liberated Auschwitz, that ended the murderous activities in Auschwitz, is not identical with the Russian war of aggression that is now occurring in Ukraine. Anyone who mixes up those two events injures basically everyone who was part of the concentration camp, and also those who, as members of the Red Army, made sure that the killing in Auschwitz came to an end. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, my experience with Andrei Bubalo influenced me a great deal. And the same when I met Eva Buster-Nahimi, who was a prisoner in many sub-camps. Eva Buster-Nahimi, for me, embodies remembrance. Because in the 1970s, Weimar didn't want to hear anything about the concentration camp. All traces of the concentration camp had been gotten rid of. If Richard von Weizsäcker, then the federal president, had not taken the initiative that pupils, students remember, getting them to ask questions what happened in their neighborhoods, if that initiative had not existed, we would still have the feeling that nothing ever happened in Weimar. So that I had the honor to be here today and yesterday to stand next to Eva Buster in Weimar and to honor her or to participate in her honor to become an honorary citizen of Weimar, that was only possible because of that. And that was only possible because Mr. Weizsäcker had the courage to raise these questions. And also, it is down to the teachers who took up the challenge and worked with youngsters on this topic. And I remember very well that my parents said to me, children should not ask any questions. And that brings me to the death marches. Death marches where 250,000 people were driven to their deaths, were physically killed, were exterminated. They walked through our villages. I read the story of Saalburg. The local representatives of security, the Volkssturm, the police, and so on, they knew when the death march would be in the next village. They actually accompanied them through the communities, through the villages. And the National Socialists, who were still members of these communities, noted down who actually looked out of the window at the time. And everybody knew they could not pass on bread to those on the death march, because otherwise they would be forced to march with them. And that is why it is so important important that we tell these stories, that those who fled tell their stories, because only those are able to tell us who denounced them, who participated in the denunciations. So I'm saying this very consciously, and I'm asking this question very consciously. What is the perspective we are taking when we describe memories? And what is the perspective we have to take up when contemporary witnesses are no longer there to correct us? 5,700,000 and something. That's the membership number of the NSDAP. Another membership number of the SS. A member of the Horse SS. SS Obersturmbannführer. Yes. That's a story which is incredible, because this person is linked to the most successful television history of a man. Walt Disney made a film of this man in space. You know who I'm talking about? Werner von Braun. Werner Magnus Maximilian von Freiherr von Braun. His story is being told. In 1949, he received a big honor from the Federal Republic of Germany, a Federal Cross by the Federal Republic. In the year 1974, 25 honorary doctorates were awarded to Werner von Braun. And when the new airport was built in Tegel in Berlin, a portrait was hung on the wall. The person who apparently, when here in Dora, did not see how you fared, who said he saw some starving people, but who, up to the very end, never once admitted that his career was based on the extermination of people in Peenemünde and the production of the V2 weapons. Therefore, I believe we need to learn to take the perspective of the victims. We need to tell the story of the past from the perspective of the survivors, not from the perspective of those who benefited from events and continued to benefit for a long time. Even when Werner von Braun left NASA and went into another company, on that day, the value of the Fairchild shares went up by 30%. That's successful work on the back of tens of thousands of people who were murdered here and brought to death. This is why I'm saying this, and I'm contrasting this, because yesterday in Buchenwald we heard the chair of the Central Committee of Jews, Mr. Schuster, said a conversation between Jorge Semprún and Elie Wiesel. And the two are having a conversation. It's documented in a book, and he quoted from this, and both remember that when they were liberated from the camp, they felt guilty. They felt as if they were the ones kind of at fault. The survivors somehow got in the way. That's how they felt. Not Werner von Braun. He was taken to America, and his team. Naftali First yesterday said he survived for 13 years in the children's block. He walks into the town after liberation. They are hungry, and they are astonished that there's normal life in the town. They're astonished that there's bakeries, restaurants, that there's food. And his friend walks into a shop and asks for food because he's hungry. They are thrown out. This is how we treated people who came from the camps. This is how we treated those who wore striped clothing. They got in the way. They dared to survive. And this is why I'm telling this with emotion. We have to always tell the story from the perspective of the victims, and the perpetrators have to acknowledge their responsibility. And if responsibility is not acknowledged, we cannot speak of what has occurred. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I am grateful that I am allowed to spend time with you. My last comment: on every journey I've ever undertaken, in every country I visited, I always made a point to visit the memorials to victims. In Israel, I had Natalie first accompany me to guide me, um, because you have to tell the story from the perspective of extermination. Therefore, it is very important to me the former prison in the Netherlands. I'm annoyed that a portrait of Georg Schröder, a judge at the Federal Court of Labour, it's still there. There's no labeling that indicates that he was responsible for the Dutch prison. And I'm glad that we now have a commission to look into all the judges who had the highest positions in Germany and their role in the former Nazi regime. And Georg Schröder's, he actually organized Arization. His portrait still is shown in Erfurt in a gallery commemorating former judges. So that is what I don't understand, and this is why, Mr. Watzke, Mr. Weinberg, we need to look through your eyes on what happened. We mustn't lean back and say, oh, times were different. Therefore, I tried to explain to events in Ukraine, times have not changed. In France, we are seeing what is occurring politically, and in Ukraine, we are experiencing atrocities committed against the population. So never again means that we need to look at what happens. It means we need to look at what occurred and the painful events that happened. And I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to spend time in Auschwitz, to be speaking to commemorate the Sinti and Roma as the president of the Federal Council. To quote Paul Celan, death is a master from Germany. We need to make sure that this mastery no longer emanates from Germany. Thank you very much for being here. Mr. Weinberg, Mr. Watzke, Prime Minister, President of the Thuringian Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. About 9 months ago, we began our volunteership in the Mittelbau Dora memorial. During the very intense period, we have come to know this historic place as a place of learning and commemoration. One of the main tasks for us is to explain the historical significance of this place to visitors and to convey to them how concentration camps could even work during the period of National Socialism. One of our concerns is to make the past more tangible. We want to support visitors to look more critically at their own understanding of history, to question it. We support them in asking, what is the significance of the past for our present, for our future? Places like this can often only give first impulses that visitors can take away with them in their daily lives. Compared to last summer, my own view of the past has changed. With every historic document and with every report of survivors, my understanding for the place we are at today has grown. When I'm out and about, I often ask myself automatically what traces the period of National Socialism has left behind in the the villages, in the towns I'm visiting. Were there concentration camps, forced labor camps, or prisoner of war camps, where people suffered, people who were labeled as less worthy? What are the inhabitants saying today about this past? Is there any interest to even look at one's own urban history or the history of one's village? Also, places I believed I knew very well changed through my period as a volunteer. My hometown of Münster is one of these examples. Only recently I came across a former forced labour camp which I hadn't come across before at all and which is hidden in the forest. In such situations, I'm noticing in how many places the crimes of Nazi Germany still don't play a role in social awareness, and how little interest there is to engage with such places and sites because of the collective ignoring of such historic places. The work of memorials is so important. Places like this memorial site can continue where school lessons stop. In schools, the period of National Socialism is an important part of history lessons. Nevertheless, I didn't learn enough when I was at school. We mostly learned about figures, propaganda, and the front lines. The murderous interplay of state and society and the catastrophically neglected engagement in the post-war period did not play any role. Even today, 77 years after the end of the Second World War, the scope for people to act are often presented as hardly existent in school lessons, which means that the German civil society is presented as without a free will and incapable of action, as a victim of Nazi dictatorship. This needs to change. The most important topic I've only understood when I started to work here as a volunteer, which is that concentration camps were a crime of society. Because even though it is hard to imagine for many visitors, concentration camps didn't just come up. They weren't hidden, they weren't kept secret, and they worked especially because German civil society was part and parcel of these crimes, helped to commit these crimes on a voluntary basis and profited from these crimes in many cases. 77 years after the liberation of this place, it is still important that this fact becomes part of our collective memory. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to ask you